everybody. It's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. Man, have I got a special one for you today. Spies. This is like the James Bond kind of secret project. Mind control. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA, and the tragedy of MKULTRA. Here it is. We've been hearing all about this with the recent Trump release of the final JFK files. There was nothing in there about the CIA assassinating the president, but there was a lot of interesting stuff about what the CIA was doing in foreign countries. My guest is John Lyle. He's a historian of science and the American intelligence community. He earned a PhD in history from the University of Texas and has taught courses on U.S. history, cyberspace, and information warfare at the University of Texas, Louisiana Tech University, and Austin Community College. His writing has appeared in Scientific American, Smithsonian Magazine, Skeptic, hey, that's mine, the Journal of Intelligence History, and Physics in Perspective. He was on the show for his previous book, The Dirty Tricks Department, about Stanley Lovell, the OSS precursor to the CIA and the masterminds of World War II secret warfare. In volume 25, number 2 of Skeptic, he wrote about MKUltra, the CIA program in search of mind control technology. And now he has a new book out. Here it is again, Project Mind Control, and which is something of a sequel, I guess, huh, John?
It is kind of a sequel. The first book kind of ends teasing this connection between Stanley Lovell, the head of this R&D branch in the OSS, and Sidney Gottlieb, who's the head of MKUltra. When Sidney Gottlieb was put in charge of MKUltra, he didn't really know how to proceed. This was a project that was supposed to develop methods of mind control. Can we use drugs or hypnotism or something else to manipulate people into doing things or to revealing truths during interrogations? And so, not knowing really how to start, Sidney Gottlieb went to the old OSS files and was rummaging through Stanley Lovell's papers and kind of found some inspiration for what he was going to do. So there is kind of a direct connection between the two books.
Yeah, interesting. And there's been a couple books out on this subject. Stephen Kisner's Poisoner in Chief, which you reviewed for us in Skeptic, and John Mark's The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Oh, and another one, I haven't read this one, H.P. Albarelli's A Terrible Mistake. Anyway, so give us a little, what new archives you found to update these.
I think this is the most exciting part of my book, really, is that the major source for this book is a series of depositions that occurred in the 1980s. Several victims of MKUltra who had been part of some experiments by Ewan Cameron, who was a psychiatrist in Montreal at the Allen Memorial Institute. He was doing things like what he called psychic driving, having repeated auditory messages playing in the headphones of these people for hours and hours and days on end. He would put them in chemical comas and sensory deprivation areas. He would do electric shock therapy, what he called therapy, but just these awful experiments on these people. And in the 1980s, after the Church Committee kind of revealed that MKUltra was a thing and the public recognized that this had gone on, several victims of Ewan Cameron sued the CIA, and they got this attorney, Joseph Rao, a famous civil rights attorney, to represent them. It turns out that the lawsuit was settled out of court. The CIA paid these plaintiffs $750,000, which coincidentally is the same amount that they paid to Frank Olson's family. We might talk about that. But right. So that was settled out of court. And as part of the lawsuit, before a trial was going to happen, Joseph Rao and his young law partner, James Turner, they took depositions of a lot of people involved in this. They took multiple depositions of Sidney Gottlieb. I mean, this is, a stenographer typed out these depositions, and Sidney Gottlieb's depositions run to over 800 pages. So it's just 800 pages of his verbatim answers to the questions that these attorneys are peppering him with. Robert Lashbrook is another big player in the MKUltra story. He's the guy who dosed Frank Olson with LSD. His deposition was taken. Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, his deposition. Many of the victims have their depositions taken for these lawsuits as well. It was ultimately settled out of court. And then these depositions were just in the files of Joseph Rao. When he passed away, his files were donated to the Library of Congress. And I was kind of rummaging around and realized that there's thousands of pages of typed like just depositions, these verbatim transcripts of what these people were saying about what they were doing if they were the perpetrators or what they went to as the victims. And so it's so exciting as a historian to find this kind of information, these kinds of sources, because usually in history you don't have dialogue, which dialogue really makes a story exciting. So in fiction, they use a ton of dialogue. In history, you hardly ever get dialogue because nobody's there to actually write down what people are literally saying, except when it's a deposition. And you do have that literal transcript. So I'm very fortunate to have found these. And that really is the base of the story. These depositions, getting into the heads of these people and having them answer for themselves in many cases what they were doing and why they were doing it.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, a gripping story, really. I had a insight for you here. Did you see the film Oppenheimer? Of course you
I
did.
did, yes.
Sure, yeah. So, it opens with his hearing, his depositions. It wasn't really a trial, I guess, but, about his security clearance and all that stuff. And then, is it Christopher Nolan was the...
Yes.
Yeah. Does a flashback, so it starts in the court, with the deposition, then flashes back and comes back to that as a thread. Somebody needs to take your book and make it into a drama film like that, because it's a great story. It's incredible.
I'm hoping so. If anyone's listening, hey, the options are open, so let me know. I would love for that to happen.
You should shop it around with some screenwriters to see if they, convert it, because the text is right there. They just have to memorize the dialogue.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking when I was writing this too. I thought this lends itself so well to some kind of dramatic storytelling. I mean, you have the dialogue here. I can, in my head, I was imagining Joseph Rao, this lawyer. He gets into so many fights with the opposing attorneys, and there's just so much drama going on. They bicker back and forth and all kinds of stuff in the deposition. So I thought this really would make for some kind of great dramatic series.
Totally, yeah. So now, as a historian, with a remembering script like that from the character you're writing about, who peppers a lot of this, as you put in the book, I'm not quite sure. I think it was this. I don't quite remember. What do you do with the subject's own uncertainties?
Yeah, so it depends on the subject, because someone like Robert Lashbrook, again, he was involved in this effort to dose people with LSD. He was very reluctant to say anything in his depositions. In fact, he had a CIA attorney representing him, and there were certain points in the depositions where the CIA attorney would tell Robert Lashbrook, "Are you sure you don't remember that?" Because he was refusing to answer just so many basic things that it was obvious that he just didn't want to say anything. So it depends on the subject. So someone like Robert Lashbrook just doesn't want to say anything. That kind of makes for a good story for my sake, because it raises some drama in these depositions. These attorneys are bickering back and forth with him, so that it's kind of interesting to read. For someone like Sidney Gottlieb, he actually spoke a lot more than I would have expected. In fact, I interviewed the court reporter who was there for the depositions, who was transcribing this stuff. And I sent the depositions over to her and said, "Could you just look over these and tell me, does it spark any memories? Kind of what do you think about them?" And after she was done reading them, she called me and said, "I'm so surprised that he said this much. Usually in a deposition, the attorneys, the defense attorneys, they tell their clients, say the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and nothing else. Like, don't say anything else beyond the question that's asked." But she said, "I was really surprised. He would go on tangents about this or that." I then interviewed a defense attorney who was working with Sidney Gottlieb, and he said basically the same thing. He said, I introduced this in the preface to my book, but he said, with Gottlieb as a client, it really made for a lot of difficulty because, you might bring something up in a question and then he would just start talking about it and go on this tangent here. And so it's great for the historian. I mean, hey, I love that he would talk, but it might not have been so good for his case.
Right. Now that you mentioned that, I remember back in 42. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Do tell.
There is some speculation that maybe, he has a lot of remorse for what he did towards the end of his life. A lot of people who knew him, who were around him, seemed to think that he was remorseful and wanted to repent in some kind of way for what he had done. He was volunteering at leper hospitals and all kinds of stuff. So, maybe he wanted to get something off his chest. I don't know, but it's fortunate for me if that's the case that he did.
How old was he when he did the deposition? And
that was in 80 to 83 were the depositions. And let's see, I don't remember his
when did he
birthday
die?
Exactly.
I forget when he died. Wasn't that early 90s?
Let me look this up real quick. He was born in 1918 and died in 99.
Oh, 99, yeah. Well, so my point is that I think, perhaps he was feeling a little nostalgic, you sort of look back on the decades and kind of put a thread through it. What was I thinking? What did it all mean? That kind of thing. I've noticed myself doing that now that I'm 70. It's like, oh, yeah, I remember when I was 50 and then 40 and 30. And, you kind of looked for some kind of common thread, even though it's mostly just random. And this story is pretty random. So let's do a big picture here for the uninitiated listeners. The CIA started as the OSS, and the purpose of that was just information gathering for the president to make decisions about foreign affairs. Different from the FBI, which is doing just domestic affairs.
Yes.
The CIA was international information or intelligence, right?
Yes, that was the idea in the beginning, at least. On paper, that's kind of the idea. We're going to collect intelligence from around the world and inform the president on what's going on so that the president can make the most informed decisions possible. That's why we have an intelligence community. They're gathering intelligence. Pretty soon within the CIA's history, though, that changed from gathering intelligence to actually offensively doing covert operations. And so whether that's MKUltra or something else, that was a pretty early change within the CIA. In fact, I was doing some research at the Truman Library, and there are these notes from Harry Truman just written on little note cards. And he's lamenting the fact that the CIA has become kind of this cloak and dagger organization. He writes, "This was only supposed to meant to inform the president. Like, we weren't supposed to do these cloak and dagger methods. We weren't supposed to be doing all these covert operations." So he was upset about the fact that that trajectory had happened, but it was pretty early within the CIA's history that it kind of moved into cloak and dagger covert operations in addition to just collecting intelligence.
Yeah. I think in your previous book, you talked about the CIA as a sort of in between negotiations by ambassadors with foreign countries and actual war.
Okay,
We're not solving the problem by talking to them, but we don't want to invade them. So
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
the
diplomacy
CIA
by
can,
other means or
yeah,
something.
by other means, right? That are deniable. Like, I didn't know
Yes.
anything about trading arms for hostages.
Yeah, plausible deniability is a big
Plausible
part of this book.
deniability.
That
Yeah.
that's one of the factors I kind of identify as leading to some of these programs like MKUltra with plausible deniability. That kind of gives you the cover to do whatever you want, because if no one can trace it back to you, well, then you kind of have free reign because you're not going to be held accountable for what you do. So at the very end of the book, I actually identify what I call the vicious cycle of secrecy, which I think is something that happens within intelligence organizations that enables abuses like MKUltra. It starts with secrecy. I mean, it's an intelligence organization, so by definition, it needs to keep secrets, which is legitimate. It's okay for an intelligence organization to keep secrets because, after all, that's the whole point. You have to get secrets and inform the president. However, the secrecy that they're afforded often leads to this plausible deniability. Because we can keep secrets, that means that people can't look into everything that we're doing, which means that we kind of have this cover for what we're doing. The plausible deniability many times leads to reckless behavior, because again, you're not going to be held accountable. And reckless behavior leads to, in many cases, embarrassment, because somebody eventually finds out. It leaks to the press. They publish it on the front page of the New York Times, and there's this huge scandal that happened. And then embarrassment leads to more secrecy, because, okay, now we definitely have to tamp down on, any leaks getting out. We have to make sure that nobody can know what we're doing now, because we don't want a repeat of that embarrassment happening. And that just starts the cycle over again. Now you have more secrecy, which leads to more plausible deniability, more reckless behavior, more embarrassment, more secrecy, and so on.
Yeah, so I can imagine people in the CIA saying it's probably, or even the president's own advisors, it's probably better you don't know what we're doing.
Yes, yes, definitely. That's definitely the case. In fact, one of the chapters here I talk about is assassinations, and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba of the
Mm.
Congo, and Sidney Gottlieb is involved in that. He's a chemist within the CIA who heads MKUltra, and he is asked basically to develop some kind of method to kill Patrice Lumumba. He eventually comes up with anthrax. He's going to put anthrax in some toothpaste, try to sneak it into the bathroom of Patrice Lumumba so that he'll brush his teeth. This is a little bit of an aside, but Patrice Lumumba allegedly did not brush his teeth for this very reason. He was afraid that someone was going to kill him via his toothpaste. And so among his friends, it was said that he preferred bad breath to no breath at all. So I guess it worked. But the reason I bring up Patrice Lumumba is because President Eisenhower, in a meeting, basically specifically orders him assassinated. And when this is being discussed among the president's advisors and the CIA, they don't say President Eisenhower said this. They always say something like, our sources are telling us that this needs to happen, or they always use some kind of euphemism for the president to give him that plausible deniability, so that on paper you can never really trace it back to the president, even though it's pretty obvious that that's what's happening.
Yeah, in terms of game theory analysis, reminds me of the little sign on the Brinks trucks that pick up the money. Driver does not know the combination to the safe.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
President does not know what his own security agency is doing. Yeah.
There have been some reforms to get beyond that plausible deniability. So one would be to make the president have to sign off on all covert operations within the CIA. So if the president has to physically sign off and approve each specific one, then that means there is no more plausible deniability for the president. Okay, so that might keep him or her in check a little bit better if that's the case.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So, all right, before we get into the details of some of these crazy stories, then set the stage for us with the Cold War and what the Russian KGB and their intelligence agencies were doing, or the Chinese for that matter, and why we felt we needed to have first the CIA in the first place, and then MKUltra and the other sub-programs to, close there was a missile gap, so this is the mind control gap.
Exactly. Yes. A famous phrase about MKUltra. It's the Manhattan Project for the mind.
Yes.
Yeah. The CIA is created in 1947. MKUltra comes 6 years later, in 1953, and the main catalyst for that is the Korean War. During the Korean War, there were several American pilots who were shot down over Korea. They're captured as prisoners of war, and while they're being interrogated, they admit to certain things that didn't happen. So, for example, they say that they had dropped biological weapons over Korea. We dropped anthrax and typhus and cholera and bubonic plague and germs and all kinds of stuff over Korea. We're trying to infect these people. And the people in the CIA are wondering, why would these American servicemen say this? It's just not true. One theory is that they must be subjected to some form of mind control. The Koreans or the Chinese or some kind of communist power must have developed methods of mind control and are using it on these people in order to convince them to say certain things that aren't true. So there are several instances like that eventually lead the CIA to want to create its own mind control program, initially just to determine whether it's possible. Is it possible that this is what they're doing? Because if it is, we need to know how to defend against that. But that quickly morphs into, well, if it is possible, maybe we can figure out uses for it. Maybe we can use it in our own covert operations. So the Korean War, prisoners of war, is an especially big catalyst. Another is just the idea that what's his name? The physiologist who was doing the dog ringing bell experiments. Pavlov. Yeah, Pavlov. He's a Russian. Hey, and if he in the 1890s, if he was doing that in Russia back then, surely they've expanded that to human subjects now. And so if he was able to do some kind of behavioral control over these dogs, surely that they've figured out since then methods to apply it to humans too. There's there's a Hungarian cardinal, Joseph Minzinti, and he is a vocal anti-communist around this time, the late 1940s. Early 1950s, and he's basically taken prisoner and false charges are levied against him by the Communist Party, saying that he was doing all kinds of stuff that he wasn't doing. It was pretty obvious to anyone looking from the outside. He wasn't doing any of this stuff. He was just a vocal critic of the Communist Party, and they wanted him to basically remove him from influencing people. So they put him, in prison under these trumped up charges. Yet at his trial, he admits to doing them. He didn't do them. Everyone knows he didn't do them. Well, why is he admitting to this? Again, some people in the CIA are speculating maybe he's been a victim of mind control. Really, once people look into this, ironically, including this guy named Jolly West, who eventually becomes the head of one of the sub-projects, they say that what's really going on here are the traditional methods of coercion, sleep deprivation, in some cases torture, leaving lights on at all times so you can't sleep, food deprivation in some cases. So it's just the traditional methods of coercion. Yet, by the time that that's realized, the CIA had already become interested in this question of mind control. Is it possible? And they were too far down the road to not want to investigate it at that point. And so they created this MKUltra program in 1953. Alan Dulles actually gives a speech at an alumni conference in Princeton, which is very odd to be announcing this, but he says something to the effect of, we know that the Soviets are up to all these mind control techniques and we need to do something similar ourselves. I don't know why he would announce this at, some alumni conference, but that's kind of the origin of MKUltra. And then pretty soon afterwards, Sidney Gottlieb, this chemist from New York originally, he's put in charge of it.
Yeah. One of Oliver Stone's things about the whole JFK assassination has always been the Dulles brothers and how what they were, all the nefarious things they were up to through the State Department and the CIA. And, of course, there's no ties to them at all about the assassination of Kennedy, but they did do a lot of pretty nefarious things involved in a lot of activities. When you look at it, you go, yeah, that's pretty wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the things I try to draw out, especially in the last chapter of this book. It's about the conspiracy theories that propagate from MKUltra, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that, well, if someone were to do this, if the government did something as nefarious as dose these people with LSD unwittingly and perform all these experiments on mental patients, then what must they be doing now? So it brings people down the slippery slope. I don't know how the CIA can come back from the reputational damage of something like MKUltra, even if they don't do anything bad for the foreseeable future. It's just in the back of people's minds, the backlash is going to last so long. The fact that you once did that, now we can never trust you. And since you're a secret organization, we can't really know what's going on. Therefore, that doubt is always going to remain. I think that was not a great move for the CIA. The reputational damage is going to last a long time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you have the whole idea of a false flag operation. You have somebody like Alex Jones ranting about, Sandy Hook or this or that. It's all false. Everything's a false flag operation. And then, our response is, oh, come on, our government wouldn't do that. And then you find some examples like, oh, they actually did do that. Not everything, but some things. So
yeah, and the one of the things I briefly touch on in the last chapter of this book is the kind of lie that the CIA or some army personnel at Fort Detrick, the U.S. biological weapons installation, they created AIDS and then were spreading it to certain populations. That's kind of this conspiracy theory that goes around. The original article that is promulgating this conspiracy theory, it's in an Indian newspaper called The Patriot, and that's basically just a KGB mouthpiece, that they're funneling kind of their propaganda through. And the article is written by the KGB, but it claims to be written by some, American businessman. He remains anonymous, obviously, because it's the KGB. But he says, he uses this kind of argument. He says, look at what the U.S. government has done in the past. It's spread biological material through different cities, which it has, to test wind patterns. It spread, different kinds of biological material, yeast and all other stuff. And he points to stuff like MKUltra. They've done drug experiments on people. Is it so far-fetched to think that they've also done one other thing, create AIDS and basically spread it to other people? So it is the slippery slope kind of argument.
Yeah, the Tuskegee experiments on African Americans, the downwinders in Nevada from the open-air nuclear tests. I mean, our government would do things to their own citizens because they have. Now, maybe, hopefully, the checks and balances are in place now. All right, back to the 1950s and what happened to these soldiers that confess to crimes they did not commit. This is a larger issue in terms of cognitive psychology studies. Why would anybody confess to something they didn't do? I mean, it is weird. Now, some people are just weird or they want attention. So, the police department says, all right, we have this crime, and here's a hot tip line to call. And people call in, I did it. It's like, okay, we have to get rid of all those people, right? But then there are people that under certain police methods of interrogation, they do end up confessing to things they didn't do. And it isn't clear why they do that. I mean, beyond mental illness, just the way they're asked. And then you can take it all the way back to the witch trials, of which you just press them long enough sleep deprivation, enough torture, enough pain and agony. This will all go away. And they kind of let slip what it is they're looking for. So then the accused knows, well, I think this is what I'm supposed to say to make it stop. And is that what we think happened to these American pilots and captured by North Koreans?
Yeah, I think so. I think it had to do, essentially, I think they were tortured. I think, the sleep deprivation and everything else, the I guess, famous idea about torture is that you can make anyone say anything if you torture them. You can make anyone say falsehoods if they'll pretend it's the truth because they'll do anything to make the torture stop. One, quote from this book, there's an intelligence official who's talking about torture, and he says, if you have a blowtorch up someone's butt, they'll tell you anything you want them to. So that's kind of the nature of torture. It's not necessarily
where's the idea come up with of biological warfare? I mean, they must have been worried that that's what we were doing.
Yeah. The Koreans are concerned that this might be happening, but also are kind of looking for some kind of explanation in order to gain sympathy. So if we can actually say that this was done to us, then it makes the Americans or the aggressors here. I mean, they're using this mode of warfare that is banned by every international treaty, and we're the victims of this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, back to the kind of rationality behind some of these things. The Operation Paperclip was that program in which if they put a paperclip on the file of the captured Nazi, that means instead of going to Nuremberg for a trial for war crimes, they move him to Ohio and give him a house and say, you now work for our biological weapons department. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and
we did do that.
Yeah, some people have tried to make some connections between Operation Paperclip and MKUltra. I'm a little skeptical of the connections between them. I don't really follow, you know, it is true that the United States government recruited German scientists to do all kinds of stuff, to create chemical weapons and to, build basically our whole rocket, the Saturn V rocket that took us to the moon. But I don't really see the connection between that and MK Ultra that some people sometimes bring up. Um, it seems pretty clear to me that Sidney Gottlieb, who's heading MK Ultra, he's tasked with basically finding out methods of mind control. And so he starts looking in the OSS files and doing some kind of drug experiments. I think the connection that people make is it's true that the Germans were doing drug experiments too, especially truth drug experiments. They were trying to test different materials to see if there are certain drugs that can make someone tell the truth in an interrogation. However, basically everyone's doing that. So just because the Germans are doing that in World War II and then the CIA starts doing that after World War II doesn't mean that they're directly inspired. It just means that they both hit upon this idea. The OSS was doing it during World War II, independent of the Germans. The ancient saying from Pliny is, in wine lies the truth. They knew that there are substances that can make you lose your inhibitions a little bit, so that nothing is new. So I don't really see the causal connection between them that sometimes people make.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think you mentioned Rudolf Hess, not captured by the British. He flew to England and crashed his plane and spent the rest of his life in prison. But they were trying to figure out, why did he do this? What's he up to? And let's get him to talk. And the Germans were worried. Yeah, what's he going to say?
Yeah, and ironically, I kind of tease out this thread a little bit in my book as well. One of the main people who's involved in these MKUltra sub-projects, I think I mentioned him earlier, is a guy named Ewan Cameron, the psychiatrist in Montreal. He was at Nuremberg after World War II. He was a big-name psychiatrist. He was head at one point of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association. So he went to Nuremberg to basically interview these prisoners of war to determine whether they're fit to stand trial, and he determined that they're sane. And it's just ironic that, the Nuremberg Code comes out of this, the very first point of which reads basically, the voluntary consent of human test subjects is absolutely essential in any kind of experimentation. And yet, a few years later, as part of MKUltra, he's doing non-consensual experiments on his patients and being funded by the CIA to do it. It's just so ironic. And, how can you be okay in one context to acknowledge that this is okay, the Nuremberg Code, and yet in another context, you just completely abandon it.
All right. Why did they pick Sidney Gottlieb? What's his background? If you were going to set up a mind control program, wouldn't you want a psychologist or a psychiatrist or somebody that works with people that studies the mind? How did they end up with this? A chemist.
Yeah, Sidney Gottlieb, he had been in the CIA for a few years before this, so he already had a little bit of a reputation. He had been working in the clandestine service, working on things like secret writing, how to conceal writing and other kinds of stuff. He's a chemist, and so he naturally lends his work is suited for that. But the reason why he's picked is because before that, he was also working for different universities and agencies trying to detect the amount of drugs like in a organism, like in the human bloodstream or something. And so he was very good already with drugs and detecting drugs. And that was seen as kind of the main avenue that MKUltra would take. It's going to include some kind of drugs to potentially manipulate human behavior. So I think that's kind of the main reason he was situated to this. It's not like there were a ton of scientists within the CIA either. Today, it's after World War II, we kind of have this impression that, with the atomic bombs, of course, like science is integral to national security. How could it not be? But in World War I, for my dissertation, I found this quote where it's someone talking to, I forget his name. I don't know. It's someone in the military who's talking about a chemist. We have one chemist. Why would we need any more? So science isn't really seen as very integral to national security for a while. After World War II, it becomes a bigger thing. And Sidney Gottlieb is one of the first chemists who becomes involved in the CIA. And so, he's kind of the natural pick.
Yeah. So then it kind of makes sense that he gets interested in LSD and other mind control drugs. So we're going to do mind control through chemistry rather than, say, through Skinnerian and Pavlovian conditioning to shape people to do what we want them to do. The Manchurian candidate. Can we get somebody to commit murder? Well, how do you do that?
Yeah, except, after experimenting with LSD, especially for a while, Sidney Gottlieb does decide that maybe there are more promising avenues in psychology or psychiatry, and that's why he starts funding Ewan Cameron's work in Montreal to do. I mentioned psychic driving earlier. You playing repeated auditory messages. Ewan Cameron was a behaviorist, and so he believed that all human action is derived from the environment. It's all nurture, it's not nature. And so Cameron's idea was that if you can break someone down to their base self, if you can basically get the blank slate back to being blank, then you can build someone back up in your own image and create them how you want them to.
Yeah.
So Cameron's idea is, how do we get someone back to the blank slate? We have to introduce enough stress so that they forget all their pre-programmed behaviors that the environment has programmed into them over time. So how do we induce enough stress? Maybe through electric shocks, maybe through sensory deprivation and all this stuff. And then once we break them down to the blank slate, we can build them back up. So he is kind of a behaviorist, and that's the origin of why he's doing what he's doing. He thinks this is a way to cure mental illness because he thinks people with schizophrenia, well, that must have been introduced to them somehow through the environment. So if we can eliminate their prescribed actions that they've learned, then we can cure their schizophrenia by building them back up in our own image.
All right. So you list here from Morris Allen, a polygraph expert in the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, 4 main questions for the project to answer. The original Project MKUltra was Project Bluebird, to get the person to sing like a bird, right? Was that the...
Yeah, to sing like a bird.
Can accurate information be obtained from willing or unwilling individuals? Can agency personnel be conditioned to prevent any outside power from obtaining information from them by any known means? Okay, so the first one is for other people we want to get to talk, and then protect our own people from talking.
Yes.
Yeah. Can we obtain control of the future activities, physical and mental, of any given individual, willing or unwilling? Our spies or soldiers, right? And can we prevent any outside power from gaining control of future activities, physical and mental, of agency personnel by any known means? Yeah, okay, so that's a start. That's a big ask.
That is. Yeah, that is. So there are a lot of potential avenues to go down with that. Obviously, drugs and kind of psychiatry we talked about. Originally, there was some discussion within the CIA. Maybe we can do it through lobotomies. Maybe we could, stick an ice pick up someone's nose and move things around a certain way. And, that'll, if nothing else, maybe produce amnesia. So if they've been a part of something that we don't want anyone to know, we can induce amnesia in them. It was quickly discussed within the CIA. This never actually happened, these lobotomy things. But it was quickly discussed that if this ever got leaked to the public, then, we would suffer so much damage that we would never recover from it. So we can't do lobotomies. It's ironic that they then went ahead and did everything that they did in MKUltra if that was one of their concerns. But lobotomies never made it beyond that stage because of the fear of potential backlash that would happen in the future.
And Kennedy's sister was lobotomized, right?
Yes, she was. And I don't know the story too well, but apparently afterwards she was in psychiatric institutions for a lot of her life, I think.
Yeah,
so it really affected her terribly.
And then a subdivision of that, can we create by post-hypnotic control an action contrary to an individual's basic moral principles? Could we seize a subject and in the space of an hour or two by post-hypnotic control have him crash an airplane, wreck a train, etc.? Can we force a subject, unwilling or otherwise, to travel long distances, commit specific acts, and return to us or bring documents or materials? And so on. Okay, so you know what I thought of when I read that? Here's a completely crazy idea. Could we get, I don't know, let's just make up a number, 19 guys to hijack 4 jets and train them to just learn how to fly but not land? And then they're going to do this at different airports in the United States and then crash them into the 2 World Trade Center buildings, the Pentagon and the Capitol building, and look forward to it and be excited about it. How could we possibly, what drugs could we possibly use to get anybody to do such a crazy thing? All right. So, I mean, we already know how to do this, right? Religion is one way to get people to do stuff like that.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to include the epilogue of the book, I kind of at the end of MKUltra, through these depositions of Sidney Gottlieb, he admits, like, the attorneys are asking him, what did you discover? What did you find of MKUltra? And he says, most of what we found was negative information, like things that you can't do. It's not really possible to do this through drugs or whatever. But at the end of the book, I say in the epilogue, well, mind control kind of is possible. It is possible to manipulate people into doing certain things in certain ways. It's not really through drugs. I'm sure you can make them lose their inhibitions and make them seem crazy. And if they're tripping on LSD, they might do some crazy things, but you can't really control what they do. However, the people who are best at manipulating human behavior and beliefs are like cult leaders. And the methods that they use are, I mean, I like Stephen Hassan's explanation of this, the BITE model: behavior, information, thought, emotion. If you can control someone's behavior, whether it be what they wear, who they can talk to, where they go, that's one method of manipulation, combined with information control. So the amount of information that someone receives, where they receive it from, teaching them to distrust outside information, that's information control. Thought control, so making them perform rituals or repeat mantras to themselves or say prayers or sing hymns or that kind of thing, like repeatedly enforcing the beliefs inside someone. And then emotion control, making them feel certain emotions to make them beholden to the cult. So anger, fear, guilt, something like that. So those are ways that you actually can manipulate someone. So, I mean, mind control is possible. It's just not necessarily through the MKUltra methods that the CIA was trying to
Well,
discover.
at the same time as your subject that you're writing about, it was the madmen at Madison Avenue who were trying to manipulate people into buying cigarettes or drinking certain alcohol or whatever. Yeah, I had Steve Hassan on the podcast. I've read his book. I've known him a long time. I like his BITE model. The question then is, how do you explain the counterfactuals, the people that have these experiences or get influenced that way, but don't join the cults? Okay, so this is an ongoing debate that I have on this show, but that's in cognitive psychology. Hugo Mercier, for example, thinks that most people are not that gullible, that we're mostly rational about most things. Most people don't give all their money to Scientology, even though they've taken the personality test or did the little cans and found out that they had an issue with their mother or something. But then they don't go, oh, here's all my money. It takes a lot of steps,
It does.
Most like on the NXIVM cult. Most of the women that took these empowering workshops and seminars through that company, they didn't get his initials branded in their crotch. They didn't give him all their money and all that stuff. Most people don't fall for it. So I think what concerned me about Steve's last book, The Trump Cult, are really 76 to 80 million Americans in a cult? No, come on. People vote their political team and, maybe there's some hardcore insiders that, worship Trump or something. But, the average voter's not in a cult, right? So we have to be careful about, using that word as if, we're all equally susceptible to mind control techniques like that.
There might be a bit of survival bias to it, too, because I can't remember where I read this, but an example of if someone were trying to convince people to invest with them, like give me your money and then I'll invest it and make you a bunch of money. What you would do is get a bunch of people to sign up and then tell half of them, to buy and half of them to sell. And whichever way it goes, whoever's the losing half, the next day, you just don't talk to them. You just stick with the people who it worked for. Then you split them in two, then half buy, half sell, and keep doing that. And over a certain amount of days, the people who are left are the ones that, wow, he's been right 10 days in a row. Like, wow, this is great. Like, I'm going to invest a lot more money with him. And then they take it and run after that, So it's, it was inevitable that there were going to be half of the people who made it to that, or a certain number of people who made it to that end point. You just never know who it was originally, starting from the initial population.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's such a great example. Yeah, all the people that did the cult stuff but didn't join or whatever influenced. How do you explain them? Right, the counterfactuals. Okay, so Bluebird becomes artichoke. Did you say explain where that name came from? Or do we know?
I don't think so. I don't remember. I don't know where it comes from. Artichoke. Yeah.
I couldn't find anything either. And then MKUltra. What is that? What's the origin of that word?
Well, MK, so anytime within the CIA you see a two-letter designator like that, there's MK, there's MH, there's some other, that indicates the division within the CIA that it's under. So MK was the Technical Services Staff, the TSS, which eventually became the TSD, which eventually became the OTS, which, there's like so many changes, throughout this, but it's hard to keep track of sometimes. But that just is the indicator, the first two letters of the division it fell under. And then Ultra, as far as I could tell, was just an homage to like the Ultra effort during World War II to decrypt the German Enigma machine. So I think it was something like that.
Yeah, I love this paragraph from your book. Bluebird, Artichoke, MKUltra, Chemical Branch, Technical Services Staff, Office of Security, Office of Policy Coordination, Office of Scientific Intelligence. If it all seems confusing, that's because it was meant to be. These things are not bureaucratically neat, Sidney Gottlieb said when he asked why the CIA frequently changed the names of its projects and departments. You see, in an attempt to make it very hard for memos to be understood by people who weren't supposed to understand them, these techniques were used on purpose. Then I love your discussion of euphemisms, which is so good. Torture isn't torture; it's enhanced interrogation. I thought that was a Dick Cheney thing. I guess it goes back before that. Kidnapping is extraordinary rendition. Oh, assassination is elimination, or executive action, or in the Reagan administration, this is my favorite one, preemptive neutralization.
Yeah.
Oh
it's very, I mean, George Orwell has something to say about this in his essay on politics and the English language about the euphemisms that the state uses to really paint a pretty picture about what's going on. But why can't we just talk about it in ordinary language? You're assassinating someone. But if you do that, that brings up legal issues, and again, the plausible deniability. No, we didn't assassinate someone. We just preemptively neutralized them, of course.
Yeah. All right. Give us a brief history of the discovery of LSD and why everybody was so obsessed with that as the miracle, whatever drug that's going to do this.
1938, Albert Hofmann, this Swiss chemist at Sandoz Pharmaceutical, he develops this new chemical, LSD. Initially, it doesn't really make him interested that much. He doesn't, do anything with it. It sits on his shelf for about 5 years, but he has a nagging suspicion that maybe there's something actually to this thing. So he takes some out 5 years later, 1943, and some accidentally contacts his skin. Just a minuscule amount accidentally touches his skin. And just from that tiny amount, he starts, hallucinating a little bit. He feels weird. His body seems off. He's seeing colors. And so he knows, something is up with this. He does some more tests after that and realizes that this is an extremely powerful hallucinogen. That's one of the reasons, not only it being a hallucinogen that makes it of interest to the CIA, but also it is so effective. Like such a minute dose of it can have such a powerful effect. There's hardly another drug that's as powerful, that packs as much punch for the amount that you get. So when the CIA first started learning about this, they said, this is, the drug that's going to open our eyes to the world. This is going to enable us to do all kinds of stuff. It was like the miracle drug that's going to do, all kinds of things for covert operations and interrogations. So that's the origin of LSD. The CIA becomes interested in it again so that it can use it in order to try to manipulate human behavior, especially in interrogations. However, they also want to use it since it's a hallucinogen. If someone takes it, they're kind of seem like they're off their rocker. What if we can use it in a covert operation to make someone seem crazy? So let's say there's, someone running for president in the Philippines and we don't like them because maybe they're communist adjacent or they have ties to the Soviet Union or something. If we want to harm their campaign, what if before a political rally, we splash a little bit of LSD in their water, they drink it, and then when they start giving their campaign speech, they're going to seem incoherent. No one is going to trust them for that. So it has practical, covert operations use as well. There was some discussion among people within the CIA, like Sidney Gottlieb, whether we should do this to Fidel Castro. Of course, there are a lot of assassination attempts on Castro, but there are also attempts to make him seem insane by slipping LSD into a cigar before he gives some kind of national broadcast that would make him seem insane. Sidney Gottlieb actually advised against that, saying that we don't know what he's going to say, so maybe it'll make him seem insane and people won't like him, but also maybe he'll say we need to start nuking the United States or something. So should we really let the genie out of the bottle? We don't really want him to, do anything possible that there's potential for that to go really bad.
Yeah, that reminds me of Operation Northwoods. Again, the Kennedy era suggestion that we set up false flag operations as a pretense to invading Cuba again or killing Castro or whatever. To his credit, Kennedy turned this down. No, we're not going to shoot down an American airliner and call it, say the Russians did it, and kill Americans in that process. But that it was even tabled as an option is, again, one of those stories like, what? Really?
It is, yeah. You see, within these CIA documents, you do see some outlandish things like that. As it's almost as if they're doing war games, like they're just figuring out scenarios, like, well, what if this? I don't know if it's always that we intend to do this. For example, with Operation Northwoods, I don't know how far along that got or whether they were actually intending to do that in a certain circumstance. I don't know about that one. But there is an example from Project Artichoke, kind of the precursor to MKUltra, where some guys are speculating, well, what if we could drug someone with something and basically gain control of their behavior like a Manchurian candidate? Then we would be able to have them assassinate this foreign leader. And then what would we do with the person? Well, obviously, we'd have to liquidate him and get rid of him and nobody would know and all this stuff. But they're not actually thinking they're going to do that because they don't even have the capability to do that. They're just kind of speculating, like, here's the potential for this. So in some circumstances, some of these things seem outlandish, and they are outlandish, but that's kind of the point, just to see how
Yeah.
far we're pushing these
I
scenarios.
like your story about on August 16th, 1951, dozens of residents of Pont Saint-Esprit, a sleepy French town dotted with medieval buildings, began experiencing vivid, nightmarish hallucinations. One man jumped into a river because he thought that snakes were eating him alive. Another told a doctor that his heart had fallen out of his chest, and he begged him to put it back in. Yet another ripped off his clothes and danced naked in the town square. Reporter from Paris noted, "The doctors are beside themselves with work. The rumors are wild and contradictory. Fear hangs over the town everywhere. No one knows when it will end." 5 people ultimately died. And the cause of this was rye bread contaminated with ergo fungus. That's so great.
Yeah, but this is an important moment for the CIA, though, because if it's the case that this hallucinogenic fungus can cause so much havoc within just this small, sleepy French town, what would happen if the Soviets decide to spike a city's water supply with LSD?
Right.
Okay, well, I mean, this small little fungus in a bunch of bread caused enormous havoc for this French town, but this could be done on a mass scale with LSD because it's so potent. So this was one of the main concerns of MKUltra. What would happen to people if they unwittingly get dosed with a hallucinogen? Are they going to go out killing people or kill themselves? So that's one of the big motivations for Operation Midnight Climax, kind of the most famous subproject of MKUltra. George White, this Bureau of Narcotics agent, starts dosing people with LSD unwittingly, and then he eventually moves to San Francisco and starts hiring prostitutes to dose their clients with LSD while he watches behind a one-way mirror, sitting on a toilet, drinking martinis that he bought with CIA funds. It's just a crazy story, but he wants to know, and he's reporting back to Sidney Gottlieb, what do these people do unwittingly, or when they're unwitting and they're dosed with this stuff, just in case someone does this to us? We'll at least know what the symptoms are and maybe know how to control them or something. So yeah, that the Pont Saint-Esprit, poisoning, that was a big catalyst for ideas within the CIA about this. This can actually serve as like a weapon against people.
Yeah,
It turns out that the CIA then hired a person to calculate if LSD was released in a water supply, like how many people would it affect? And I think he came to the conclusion that there was too much chlorine in the water and it would just disrupt the LSD and it wouldn't do anything.
That's funny. Well, that would be my alternative for your film version of your book would be open, because sex sells, opens with a scene in one of these San Francisco hotels with the prostitute dosing the client. The clients, though, were people we wanted. Were they average people or CIA
In cases, they
employees?
were specifically Chinese people because the
Oh,
CIA wanted to determine like the makeup of Chinese psychology. And so
oh,
if we get
right.
these people in, how are they, mostly because they're worried about communist countries. So what's going to happen?
Yeah, I loved your conclusion of the whole thing was that the LSD didn't do anything, but the fact that the women hung around and wanted to talk to the guys, and the guy's ego was kind of stroked, and they're like, happy after with pillow talk, like, "Hey, you know what I do, baby?"
Exactly. Yeah. You can't make people talk through drugs, but maybe through the sex because
Yeah.
these clients afterwards, one of the CIA agents is saying that it's a real boost to the guy's ego. The fact that this woman, usually a prostitute, after it's over, she just gets up and leaves. Like, why would she stay? But now they're kind of staying around because they're letting, George White behind the mirror observe what's happening. And these guys, what are they going to talk about? Not the sex. They're definitely not going to talk about that because, they finish and they might be embarrassed about it. So instead they start talking about their work. Well, you know what I do? I work for this plant and blah, 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 blah. That's how you get information out of people.
That's too funny. All right, probably the most famous case of the MK Ultra is the Frank Olson death, shall we say,
Mhm.
just death, murder, jump, suicide. I don't know. Okay, so and we know about it because of his son Eric Olson, who's had this ID fixed for decades
Mhm.
to I don't know what expose what really happened to his father. So give us that whole story because it's fascinating and what you think what actually happened because we don't know for sure.
Yeah. So this is 1953 still, I think, right at the creation of MKUltra, several scientists within the CIA, including Sidney Gottlieb, who leads in MKUltra, Robert Lashbrook, his young kind of chemist colleague, and several others, they occasionally meet with several scientists from Fort Detrick, which is the country's biological warfare installation. They get together at a retreat called Deep Creek, and they share information with each other. What are you working on? Can we use this? It's just a work retreat. However, at this one work retreat, Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook decide that they're going to spike the liquor with LSD, pass it out to everyone there, or not quite everyone, because there's one guy who's a reformed alcoholic and they're not going to give him any. There are a couple of people who don't get it, but for the most part, everyone gets it except two people. And they want to observe basically how it's kind of like a prank. It doesn't sound like a fun prank, today. This is awful. But I think the way that Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook were thinking about it as, we play pranks around the office. We're going to spike, some LSD into this liquor and kind of see how people behave. So that's what happens. After about 20 minutes after the LSD is put in the liquor, people start drinking it. Sidney Gottlieb announces, we've just given you, this hallucinogen. I just want to let y'all know, and blah, 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 so let's see how this plays out. They start seeing colors. The room starts spinning. Most people after a few hours they go to bed, except for Frank Olson, who can't sleep that night. He is one of the scientists from Fort Detrick who is involved in the airborne distribution of pathogens, like helping to create different kinds of biological weapons. But he apparently has this terrible reaction to the LSD. It's almost like it induces a psychosis in him. After they return home from the retreat, his wife notices that he's not behaving the same. She has a talk with him and asks him what's going on. And he basically just says, I messed up the experiment. I messed it up. They don't like me. He's paranoid. He goes to his boss's office and he says the same thing, like, I'm sorry I messed up the experiment. You should just fire me or I should just quit. And the boss is wondering, what are you talking about? You're a good employee. I'm not going to fire you. But something psychologically seems to be wrong with Frank Olson by this point. So Sidney Gottlieb, Robert Lashbrook, and a couple other people who are associates decide that they need to send Frank Olson to a psychiatrist, if he's not quite a psychiatrist, but a guy named Harold Abramson, whose office is in New York. Harold Abramson has connections to the CIA already. He already kind of knows about these LSD experiments, so that's good for the CIA, so he's not going to leak this stuff. He's already kind of informed. So a few people accompany Olson to New York to see Harold Abramson, and Abramson explains that he thinks Olson is in some kind of psychotic state that was induced by this LSD experiment. It then becomes Thanksgiving, and so the scientists decide to return to Washington, D.C. because they're going to meet with their families. But as soon as they land back home, Olson is in this paranoid state again, and he says, no, I need to go back to New York. And so they fly him back to New York, and while they're he meets with Abramson again, and Abramson says, how about you go to a psychiatric hospital or something? I can book you into one. And he agrees to it. So they schedule for him to go to one. However, it doesn't have any rooms available that night, so they have to wait an extra day. So they spend the next day, they spend Thanksgiving, basically, Olson does, with one of his colleagues. And the next day, they go to bed, and at 2:30 in the morning, Olson jumps out the window through the glass in the screen on his 10th floor hotel window and falls down and dies on the pavement. So that's kind of encapsulated the Frank Olson story, precipitated by this LSD experiment at Deep Creek. Frank Olson's son, Eric Olson, he thinks that that's not quite the story. He thinks that the CIA was intentionally trying to kill his father. And in fact, there was someone else in that hotel room that pushed Frank Olson out that window. Frank Olson didn't jump out the window. He was pushed. He was intentionally murdered, partially because maybe he knew something about the U.S. using biological weapons in Korea and had moral qualms about it, and somebody wanted to silence him, so this didn't become a big story. That's what Eric Olson thinks. I don't think that's the case. I think Frank Olson did commit suicide. I think he took this LSD. I think he did have some kind of psychotic break. Another piece of evidence that people will point to for the Frank Olson death potentially being a murder is that in 1953, the CIA writes this assassination primer. It's this book that explains how to conduct a proper assassination that won't lead to anyone discovering what happened. And one of the main suggestions it has is a fall from a tall building is especially effective, so,
Yes.
it lines up perfectly. He fell from a tall building, and this primer in 1953 is saying that. Again, I think it's more a matter of correlation than, something else.
Yeah.
So I don't really buy into the story that he was intentionally killed. There are other people, I mentioned a couple in the story, who take LSD unwittingly, like Frank Olson, and the same kind of thing happens to them. They have kind of a psychotic break. One woman is committed to a mental institution for basically the rest of her life. After this, there are multiple people who this kind of thing also happens to. So I think it's more probable that Frank Olson was just unfortunate and had that kind of bad trip that produce that psychotic break than it is that someone is orchestrating and masterminding this assassination against him.
Yeah, wasn't the phrase they used? Drop him by the head. Hold him by the legs and drop him by the head. Yeah, I think you're probably right. I wasn't sure what to think about that. I watched the Wormwood, 6-part series on Netflix. Earl Morris's film. He's one of my favorite filmmakers. The Fog of War is just a phenomenal film about McNamara and that whole Cold War era. Just amazing. He ends up running 2 scenarios at the end, just for our listeners, and you decide. He kind of leaves it open, I guess, for the viewers. Yeah, but the federal government did settle with the Olson family, gave them $750,000, but did not admit any wrongdoing. Is that right? Something like that? Wasn't there some language?
Yes, there were rumblings around that Alice Olson, once this came out in 1975 through the Church Committee, the Senate investigation into the past abuses of the intelligence community, that kind of revealed that, Frank Olson had died through this experiment and not something else. The family didn't know for all those years, 20 years, they were in the dark about what actually happened. They finally realized after this investigation that their husband was a part of this experiment. Somehow LSD is connected to his death. And so there are rumblings that now they're going to take out a big lawsuit against the CIA or against the government. And in order to kind of stop that, the Gerald Ford administration invites them to the White House. President Ford personally meets with them and personally apologizes, and they give them $750,000 in exchange for kind of the promise that you're not going to sue the government.
Right. But there was some language about we're not admitting any wrongdoing or something like that. They kind of left it open that way. I guess the other famous one, because of Tom O'Neill, the author, his book Chaos. I was not familiar with that until I saw him on Rogan. So I listened to the whole 3 hours, like, oh my God. But to his credit, he admits, I don't have a smoking gun. He just told that to Rogan. And in the book at the end, 500 pages. Thanks a lot. It took me like 20 hours on an audiobook listening to this thing. And I get to the end, he said, but I don't. But the premise is interesting, tied to everything you're talking about here, because the idea is more with Charlie Manson, I guess, and some of the later cases after the MKUltra had kind of peaked with the LSD experiments, because by then LSD had trickled out into the general population. And so when Manson is giving his his cult members, the girls, LSD and so on, I guess it's not clear where he got it, but probably just off the street. But so that's the idea. And so setting this up, how could he have gotten these women to commit these murders where he wasn't even there, right? I mean, Charles Manson wasn't at either of the crime scenes. Well, he was at the second one, the La Bianca home. He went in, tied them up, and then left and said, do what you got to do, and they murdered him. He wasn't at the Tate residence. So I love the story because Vincent Bugliosi had to somehow convict Manson of murder, even though he wasn't even there. Not only did he do it, he wasn't even at the premises, right? And then, but that doesn't let the women off, right? They're still responsible. Yes, they're cult members, highly influenced by Charlie. So here's that influence question, but they're still culpable. Okay, that's a tricky thing. So that's what I liked about the book Helter Skelter. But O'Neill does make a good point that Bugliosi's whole thesis of the Helter Skelter that was
like
behind
the race war.
Yeah, the race was sparking a race wars. He said that was all bullshit made up by Bugliosi to tell a good story to convict Manson and the women. He does have a good point there, but he never draws the connection that somehow Charlie was either an agent of or a product of the MKUltra. And so that the final question then is, how did he get these women to do it? Well, to me, it's just drugs and sex, and just these are young women. This is what happens.
Again, I think it's the classic methods of coercion that have been known for a long time and used in cults long before Manson. I'm glad you mentioned Chaos, though. The book itself is like, it's a good read. I enjoyed reading that book. To me, it was really kind of 3 books in one. It was about the Manson murders, so you learn about that, which I didn't really know that much about before the book. So I was happy to read and learn about that. It's also my favorite part of the book was it's like a gonzo journalist account of how he came to learn this stuff. He got assigned this article about Manson I don't know what it was, 30 years ago. And he's been on this trail ever since, collecting information. So it was fun to kind of live vicariously through his detective hunt, trying to search down this information. I liked that part of the book. And
Mm-hmm.
then the third part of the book would be some kind of connection maybe between Jolly West, who was head of an MKUltra sub-project doing hypnotism on people, and Manson, and whether maybe there's some connection there. Jolly West was in California, kind of around the same place as Charles Manson was. But again, that part was a little disappointing to me because you never draw a connection. Like, what's the connection between the two? It's ironic to me because O'Neill in Chaos does a great job of kind of tearing down Bugliosi's arguments in Helter Skelter about this race war that's going to happen, and this was why he's doing it. He wants to precipitate this race war, and O'Neill says that he's doing this to sell books. He's sensationalizing the story so that he can sell a lot of books. To me, what's interesting though is O'Neill. Why are you drawing this connection to MKUltra? You admit that there's you can't find a smoking gun connection between West and Manson. So why include that part? It seems like you're kind of sensationalizing it too. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if that's what he was intentionally doing. I think more so it's he probably did a ton of research trying to find a connection and didn't. And, the fallacy of sunk costs, I don't want to have done all this research and not have something to show for it. So I'm going to include this part in the book as well. So, yeah, but I was a little disappointed that, where is
Yeah.
the connection? There are a lot of
Yeah.
people who make these claims about any kind of nefarious actor. Well, surely if it happened in the 1950s or 60s or 70s even, it must have some connection to MKUltra. The government must be influencing them. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, surely he was a victim of one of these
Right.
things too. But the more I look into these individual cases, it's I don't see the connection. Like, what is the
Yes,
connection?
that's right. Because Ted Kaczynski at Harvard was part of a research project by one of those Harvard professors
Yeah,
who was
Henry Murray.
Yeah, Henry Murray. Right. Right. Again, if you go anomaly hunting, as this is called,
Okay.
if you dig into the details of anything that's big and famous, 9/11 or the JFK assassination, you're going to find a lot of weird stuff. Like, yeah, what about that weird thing? Like Charlie, I think O'Neill found something about Manson's parole officer had a link to the CIA or something like that. And when Manson violated his parole over and over, they just kept saying, "It's all right, Charlie, you go back out there. It's okay. Don't worry about it." Something like that. It's like, how do they not lock him back up? There was a lot of weird things like that.
Yeah. And, with the documentary that was made called Chaos on Netflix, it's kind of based on that book. It introduces an additional kind of side to the story. So you have the Bugliosi story about the helter-skelter race war. Maybe this is the motivation. You have the O'Neill story about maybe there's this MKUltra mind control influences that is causing people to do this. But then in the documentary, you hear from one of the Manson cult members. I'm looking up his name now, Bobby Beausoleil,
Oh yeah,
and he
Beausoleil.
he explains. I was part of it. He committed a murder. It wasn't one of the Tate murders, but it was like a drug deal gone wrong. He committed a murder, and he says, you know, why Manson did this is because the guy he thought lived there had rejected him from some recording contract or something like that. And why did he get his acolytes to do it, these cult members? Because Manson wanted to have dirt on them. He wanted them to get their hands dirty so that they'd be, indebted to him in some way, or, so that he would have control over them. For me, it's like, oh yeah, well,
Of course.
Soleil just says that, and that seems like the simplest explanation. So I don't
Right.
know why I wouldn't go with that one.
Right. Well, then there were the weird connections to the Beach Boys, and they were living at the Tate house before Sharon Tate was living there. I mean, it was just so many weird. Again, anomaly hunting. You can find draw the connections between the dots there. All right, other famous people connected to this: Patty Hearst. How did she get captured by the Sudanese Liberation Army? Kidnapped and then converted, and there she is with the machine gun on the CCT camera inside the bank. Is this one of these syndromes, Stockholm syndrome, brainwashing? Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. And an important thing to keep in mind too with MKUltra, it's easy for people to try to make connections. Oh, this person seems mind controlled, therefore it must be MKUltra. But it's important to keep in mind the structure of MKUltra. Many people think that it's this CIA project where the CIA agents or scientists were going out and dosing people with drugs and doing all this stuff. A lot of the sub-projects didn't have anything to do with LSD. They have to do with all kinds of other stuff. But that aside, that's not the structure that was going on in most cases, Operation Midnight Climax being the main exception. What's really happening is in most cases, there are independent researchers at prisons or hospitals or mental institutions or universities that are already doing research. They are already doing either LSD research or some kind of other psychiatric research, like you and Cameron doing sensory deprivation and all this stuff. The CIA learns about that and gets interested and then starts funding them so that they continue doing that research they're already doing. So in many cases, it's not that the CIA is making these people do that. The CIA just wants to ensure that it can continue to receive information from these people. So, even if someone was a victim of like an LSD experiment in the 1960s or something, odds are they still weren't part of an MKUltra experiment, because there were a lot of people doing that in the 1960s. A lot of psychiatrists were experimenting with this stuff. There were certain of them who were funded by MKUltra. Most of them weren't, though. So it's important to keep in mind, it's not that the CIA is actively making people or coercing them or funding them to do all this stuff out of nowhere. They're already doing these experiments in many cases, and the CIA then gets involved because they are doing it.
That's great. Yes. So it's sort of after the fact, you look back and go, okay, let's see if we can connect the dots here and there. If you look hard enough, you can do it. The same thing was done with Oswald and Jack Ruby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Jack Ruby, there is a kind of a direct connection to someone who's affiliated with MKUltra, though. Jolly West, again, that psychiatrist who is I have a chapter on Jolly West, but he has this correspondence with Sidney Gottlieb where he's telling him about these hypnotism experiments that he's doing with airmen at Lackland Air Force Base, and he gets funding from MKUltra. Jolly West is one of the psychiatrists who evaluates Jack Ruby after he kills Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is one thing that Tom O'Neill, I think, brings out in Chaos, if I'm remembering where I'm getting this from a little bit. But he kind of speculates that, Jack Ruby seems to have gone insane after this shooting. After he killed Lee Harvey Oswald, he's yelling all kinds of stuff about there's a conspiracy to kill all the Jews in the United States or all kinds of things. And Jolly West is one of the guys who tries to determine whether he's sane. And I think O'Neill, I think I'm getting that right, speculates that maybe it's the case that Jolly West might have slipped him some LSD to make him appear insane, because Jolly West was really against the death penalty, and maybe he could be seen as being insane and therefore escape the death penalty, something like that. So there are a few situations like that where Jolly West is involved with some people who were up for the death penalty, and then they go insane. There are alternate explanations, though. For instance, maybe they really were insane. If you're going to kill someone, there might be something wrong with you. Or maybe they're just pretending to be insane. They're probably not stupid. They probably know if they act this way, maybe that can get them off the hook. So there are some competing interpretations that are pretty plausible as well, besides just that it must have been this guy dosing these people with LSD to make them insane.
Yeah. In researching my conspiracy book, I came across that Mitchell and Webb bit they did on the assassination of Princess Diana. And so they're plotting here how we're going to kill her, Okay, we'll get her chauffeur drunk. Well, slightly drunk. Yes, slightly drunk. And then we'll hire these motorcyclists to chase them around, and then they'll crash. Because anyone, people in car crashes, they always die. Oh, yeah, for sure. Unless she wears her seatbelt. Well, no, she won't wear a seatbelt because, as we all know, women that are in love with, impregnated by the only man they ever loved, are notoriously slapdash about their personal safety. And then what about this and what about that and so on. They got it all down, and then the phone rings, and they go, "Oh, well, that all just happened by accident." So we'll just take credit for it.
Yeah. I don't think people realize the extent to which history really is a combination of so many different causes that it's really hard to pinpoint. If someone was a mastermind and was doing something as elaborate as, I don't know, the assassination of Princess Diana or something, the amount of things that would have to go right is just so almost unfathomable. The question that I ask at the end of the book that I say to always ask is, what's more probable? Mm-hmm. Is it more probable that there is really someone who is able to plan all of this out down to the detail and could know everything that's going to happen and prevent all the hundreds of people working on it from leaking a single thing? Or there was an accident, or,
Right.
Just something bad happened? There's probably some more probable explanations. So for any given event, there are always an infinite amount of possible interpretations. If my keys aren't on my nightstand in the morning, it could be the case that my wife took them. It could be the case that someone broke in and stole them without me knowing. It could be the case that aliens beamed them up into their spaceship. There's an infinite amount of possible explanations. And so we can't appeal to the evidence itself because all these explanations account for that evidence. What we have to do is ask, among those possible interpretations, what's the most probable one? Is it more probable that when someone says they saw an alien spaceship above them, that they actually did, or that they saw something and they misinterpreted it, or they're lying, or someone misinformed them? So you got to go with the probability.
What's more likely? That's always a good question. And also the counterfactual, like with the Jeffrey Epstein murder, why would they kill him? Well, because he has the list in his head of all the famous people that were on the island and so on. Well, Ghislaine Maxwell has that same list in her head. How come they haven't killed her? Or for that matter, on the other side, I have to admit, why didn't she cut a deal to get out of jail early? Like, I'll give you the names, and then you let me. This happens all the time. I don't know. So why did they kill Kennedy? Oh, because he was going to de-escalate the war. This, that. Okay, or he was going to break up the CIA. Remember, because after the Bay of Pigs, he cursed, the CIA, because the CIA kind of lied to him and said, "Oh, we got this all covered. It's going to be great, no problem." And then, of course, it all goes to hell. And so he's pissed and says, "I'd like to break up the CIA into 1,000 pieces." So this quote is always brought up in the JFK assassination book.
I think there's a Benjamin Franklin quote that goes something like, "What a terrible thing to be a rational creature, because we can always make an excuse for anything we want."
Yeah, exactly.
Being rational is good, but at the same time, we can always rationalize our way into explaining anything we want. If we start from a false premise, we can figure out a way to make sure that we have evidence for that false premise. We just have to rationalize the world around us in a certain way.
Yeah, right. But if the CIA killed Kennedy because he was going to de-escalate the war, and so under the pressure from the military-industrial complex, and so how come they didn't kill Nixon? He's the one who ended the war, for God's sakes, or whatever. You can always find, or every president is hated by some group of people that would, I'd like to kill Obama or whatever. Then Trump and so on. It's happened. But after the fact, when they're actually killed, then they go, okay, now we have to find who hated him the most, because that's who probably did it, right? So,
yeah.
Okay.
And with the assassinations as well, Fidel Castro is a common target of these people. The reason why the CIA never killed Castro, they tried to. Sidney Gottlieb's involved in multiple attempts on him. I already mentioned kind of the cigars. There were exploding cigars, or all kinds of things. An exploding seashell. He likes diving, so what if we have the seashell that's really pretty? We put it where he dives, and maybe he'll pick it up, and that'll trigger the explosive to kill him underwater. So they're all, maybe we can get someone to gift him a diving suit that's laced with tuberculosis, and then he'll put it on and contract this. But the reason why many of these never work, it's not that killing Castro would have been hard. You can just drop a bomb on him. You can kill someone. It's killing him without implicating yourself. How do you get away with? That's the hard thing, doing something in a way that nobody knows that it was you that actually did it. So assassinating someone would be relatively easy. You just, drop a bomb or something, but obviously it's going to be you who did it. So, if they couldn't kill Castro in such a way to not implicate themselves, I'm very skeptical that you could do that to the president of the United States too, of your own country.
Yeah. Well, Putin's figured that out. He kills opponents all the time. He dropped them.
Yeah, but people know that he's the one who's behind
it. Of course. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, other James Whitey Bulger.
Yeah, Bulger. Yeah, this Boston gangster. Yeah, he's a character. There are several MKUltra sub-projects that happen at prisons. One is at what's called the narcotic farm at Lexington, Kentucky, and the other is the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta. And that's where Whitey Bulger is, this Boston gangster. He was arrested for robbing a bank, and he's, thrown in prison. He was in the news recently. He recently got murdered in prison, but he had, committed several murders after this. But he was at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where this guy named Carl Pfeiffer, he had an MKUltra sub-project to dose many of the prisoners with hallucinogenic substances, different kinds of drugs, to see how they reacted. And Bulger was one of the people who was involved in one of these experiments. Now, the thing to keep in mind with these prison sub-projects is they actually did have consent forms. So there were consent forms that the prisoners signed. However, it is a question of how much of informed consent actually was there. There was one guy from the narcotic farm who I quote in this book named Eddie Flowers. And he talks about how, I ate this graham cracker that was laced with something, and it was the worst experience of my life. Things were crawling out of the walls and blood dripping from the ceiling, and I could see animal heads on different people. It was crazy. And he says, if I would have known that it would have been like that, then I never would have signed up for this. So there is a question of informed consent. The ironic thing and kind of scary thing, again, adding to the kind of immorality of MKUltra, is that this narcotic farm where some of these prison experiments are happening on, many of them are drug addicts who have been committed to this narcotic farm to rehabilitate. They're involved in these drug experiments by a guy named Harris Isbell. And then in exchange for participating in the experiments, they have two options. they can receive like a reduced sentence or a letter, a good letter for their parole board, or they can go to the drug bank window, stick out their arm, and get a needle full of heroin pumped right into it. And it's like, these guys are drug addicts here to recover, and yet you're incentivizing them to participate in this by giving them heroin. So yeah, there's some kind of ethical conflict there.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow, incredible. All right. History loves irony. I'm going to read this little portion from, this is so interesting, about the consequences of MK Ultra. Went beyond just the damage that it did, especially when LSD slipped out of the CIA's hands and into the counterculture. The drug gave the beat generation of writers a new definition of what it meant to be acid-tongued. I had no idea where that came from. Such a great discovery. Ken Kesey once participated in an MK Ultra sub-project and said the experience led him to pen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Of course. Now in hindsight, like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Robert Hunter participated in another sub-project and credited LSD with inspiring him to write many of the Grateful Dead's most popular songs. Allen Ginsberg reflected the irony of the situation. Am I, Allen Ginsberg, the product of one of the CIA's lamentable, ill-advised, and triumphantly successful experiments in mind control? Had they, by conscious plan or inadvertent Pandora's box, let loose the whole LSD fad on the U.S. and the world? It does kind of look like that in hindsight, right? Countercultural icon Timothy Leary thought so. I wouldn't be here now without the foresight of CIA scientists. John Lennon, the legendary singer-songwriter for the Beatles, the 1980 Playboy interview, we must be always remember to thank the CIA and the Army for LSD. That's what people forget. They invented LSD to control people, and what they did was give us freedom. That's just great. Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, that chapter is on the consequences, really, of MK Ultra. Several of the threads of MK Ultra are fairly well known. The Frank Olson incident, Operation Midnight Climax. With these depositions, though, I elaborate on a lot of different sub-projects that haven't been touched on much before. However, I think a good contribution to this book, too, is at the very end there. I talk about the consequences of MK Ultra. One of the main consequences right after that paragraph is the proliferation of conspiracy theories that come out of MK Ultra. One of the main reasons why that's the case is because in 1973, Sidney Gottlieb destroys the MK Ultra files, or at least the ones that he has, and this has opened a Pandora's box for people ever since. The fact that he destroyed those files to the conspiracy theorists means, well, we can't know what MK Ultra was, therefore it could be anything. It could have been this, it could have been this. We don't have the files. Now, for me, the last chapter is called History Loves Irony because I think that's completely wrong. Ironically, I think we know more about MK Ultra than almost any other secret project. That's a big claim, but we have more documentation of MK Ultra than almost any other secret project. Because of how sensational it was, there were committee hearings about it within the Senate, within the House, the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, and then there were specific committee hearings on Project MK Ultra. In addition to that, we have memoirs and letters and autobiographies. People have written about this a lot. They've interviewed the people. These thousands of pages of depositions I found. We have so much documentation of MK Ultra, and we have 6,000 pages of documents that were that Sidney Gottlieb didn't destroy. And among those documents are descriptions of basically every single sub-project. So to the people who say, well, we can't know what MK Ultra was, I'd say, yes, we can. Here's an analogy I kind of like to think of with this. We can't know everything that MK Ultra was. That's true because, we can't know everything about the past. We were not there. We can know a lot about it. We can know enough to know what MK Ultra was and enough to know what MK Ultra wasn't. So there are a lot of conspiracy theorists that claim that MK Ultra controls pop stars like Britney Spears today, or it hosts human hunting expeditions where they tell someone to start running and they hunt them. But we can know that MK Ultra didn't include that stuff. And here's the analogy. If I were to ask, what's the shape of the Earth? Most people would say a sphere. It's a sphere. But, that's not quite right because the Earth spins. It's an oblate spheroid. It bulges in its center as opposed to the poles. And so, it's not quite right that it's a sphere. It's really an oblate spheroid. But even that's not quite right because it has a complicated topography. There are mountains and valleys and oceans and ice caps and sand dunes and all kinds of stuff. So, we can't know the exact shape of the Earth in part because it's always constantly changing. However, we can know enough about the shape of the Earth to know that a sphere is a good approximation. It's not the exact shape, but it's pretty good. The same for MK Ultra. We can know enough about it to have a really good approximation of what it was, even though we can't know exactly what it was. In fact, we can know enough about MK Ultra to know what it wasn't, and it wasn't, all the things that conspiracy theorists are saying, just as we can know enough about the shape of the Earth to know it wasn't flat. And it's the same kind of conspiracy theorists that are promulgating both views.
Do you know that essay by Isaac Asimov, The Relativity of Wrong?
No, no, I
I
don't.
use this quote in one of my lectures. When people thought the Earth was flat, they were wrong. When people thought the Earth was a sphere, they were wrong. And then the oblate spheroid. But if you think that thinking the Earth is flat is just as wrong as thinking, or that the Earth is a sphere is just as wrong as thinking the Earth is flat, then you're wronger than both of them put
Yes,
together. Right? There's
that's a great
progress.
quote. I wish I would have known that. That's so good.
Yeah, it's quite good. Yeah. Just make a comment about Richard Condon's 1959 novel, The Manchurian Candidate, made into a film and then remade. I never saw the remake with.
Yeah, I didn't either. No.
Okay, yeah, so I don't know, but so is that a product of or an influence on MK Ultra?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's influenced by MK Ultra because MK Ultra wasn't really exposed to the public until the 70s.
Yeah,
But there are a lot of rumblings around that kind of thing, largely because these Korean War soldiers, their stories are well known, they're well publicized. So, it's not just the CIA asking the questions of why would these Korean soldiers, be admitting to things that they didn't do, biological warfare or whatever. A lot of people are then, piece two and two together and start thinking maybe there's kind of mind control. And so that becomes its own kind of sub culture, the idea of mind control. The CIA is the one who actually takes that and does something with it, tries to, create MK Ultra and do projects to manipulate human behavior. But there are a lot of people who come to the same conclusion as the CIA. So that novel wasn't inspired directly by MK Ultra because he didn't know about MK Ultra, but it wasn't too hard to piece together that, well, maybe something like this could be going on.
yeah. In your references, you recommend some documentaries, Codenamed Artichokes. I watched that one. Wormwood, which I'd seen before, so I watched some of that again last night. So well produced, so good.
Yeah.
Just incredible. I hadn't seen this one, Mission Mind Control. That was that 1979 ABC special. So funny, 1970s television with all the kind of psychedelic music and colors. And so
Yeah,
the
and
guy
that
with
one's good
the
because
funky
that
suit
one
and the wide tie standing out there.
that one's particularly good for anyone who's interested in seeing some of the people who this book talks about, because in
Right.
that documentary they interview, I think Robert Lashbrook might be
Yeah.
on there.
Yeah.
So if you want to actually see and hear the physical person, that has some interviews of people who are involved.
But this one, Trance, the Kathy O'Brien story. I didn't know her story. In 1995, her 1995 book, Transformation of America, co-authored with her husband, Mark Phillips. Talk about that a little bit, because that does tie into the whole satanic panic and the recovered memory movement of
It
the
does.
90s.
That is not a documentary I'd recommend. However, I do cite it in the sources because I use something from it, and so I include it there. So she's a conspiracy theorist who claims that when she was a kid, her father signed her up basically for this MK Ultra mind control programming, where she became a sex slave for different people in the government, multiple presidents, vice presidents, governors, international leaders, all this stuff. She says she was a sex slave and was abused by all these people. She claims that she was impregnated and the fetuses were aborted and someone, would sell them in their interstate occult body part business. She claims that a president could control her with different colored jelly beans. She claims that one vice president produced a hologram over his self to make him look as if he was a lizard person so that she would start believing that lizard people were real. She claims that she was scheduled for ritualistic sacrifice at Bohemian Grove, and yet heroic intelligence officer Mark Phillips, her husband, saved her at the last second before it could happen. And all her memories were wiped away with what she calls crypto amnesia scrambling. So she was induced amnesia and she couldn't remember any of this. But then he started performing hypnotism on her and helped her to recover all these memories about the terrible things that the CIA was doing to her. I don't think any of that happened. I think she's a victim of Mark Phillips. I think he was basically inducing these memories in her or leading her to recover these memories when they didn't actually happen. And I connect this to the satanic panic by saying that Mark Phillips, I actually learned this from the documentary. He was a member of what was called the International Society for the Study of Dissociation, which is kind of a pseudoscientific organization that promulgated a lot of satanic panic conspiracy theories. The president of the organization, this guy named Bennett Braun, he was sued and he lost his medical license and had to pay over $10 million for convincing one of his patients that she had been sexually abused by her father when she was a child. Another president of this organization induced these false memories into a woman, convincing her that aliens had impregnated her and she had to abort the fetuses and eat them and all kinds of crazy stuff. And Mark Phillips, Kathy O'Brien's husband, claims that he learned how to recover memories from these people. And so I feel like, well, he's doing that on Kathy O'Brien. I think that she sincerely believes that these things happened to her. She has been saying this for decades, and her story's been consistent for that whole time. However, I don't think they happened to her. I think she's a victim of these recovered memories being induced in her. And so in that last chapter of the book, when I talk about these conspiracy theories, I talk about how a little bit about this kind of recovered memory movement and how they're not reliable. Kathy O'Brien claims that, well, surely her memories are reliable because they're so traumatic and so vivid to her. I mean, how could you forget when someone was sexually abusing you? The president of the United States, you're not going to forget that. But I do give several examples of just because a memory is very vivid and traumatic doesn't mean that it can't be false. For example, there was an experiment done, I forget at which university, but it was right after the Challenger, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. And these professors asked their students to write down the day after several of the important things that was happening that day when you heard about the disaster. Who were you with? Where were you? How did you hear about it? Who told you? 2 years later, those professors tracked down 44 of these students and had them retake that same quiz. When the Challenger exploded, who were you with? Where were you? Most of the students got most of the major details wrong. Most of them got most of the major details wrong. And when they were presented with the original quizzes they were given, and they could look at their original answers, many of them said that their original ones were false, and it's their current memories that are actually the true ones. No, I remember it better now. So yeah, our memory is not a great thing to go on.
No, and we've learned so much from cognitive science since that time that memory is not like a recording device in your head and you play it back in the theater of your mind, and the little homunculus is sitting there watching it, reporting to your cortex somewhere, this is what happened. It's nothing like that. And we know, like to your point, when people get a new memory, that's the new memory. That's it. There is no like, there's the old one and the new one, and I'm not sure what to believe. That is what they believe. They mostly, there's been a few recanters. A few people sued their therapists after the recovered memory was, well, we think, false memory was planted. But most of them actually just believed their father, grandfather, uncle, whatever molested them as children. Hard to give that up. The Ronald Cotton case with Jennifer. Now I forget her last name. She was the woman who was raped by another guy, but in a lineup, she pointed to Ronald Cotton. He spent, 13 years in prison or something, and then was exonerated when DNA came online in the 90s. And they, wrote a book together, Picking Cotton, it was called, and did some lectures together. And they work now on prison reform, but also police, the way police present lineups or, interrogate people. And Amanda Knox is also on this because the way that you ask the questions can construct the memory that the person is going to have. It's like, so again, none of this mind control stuff, it isn't at all like what we think it should be.
Yeah, I think I might have just put this in a note, but there was another experiment where, just to show how even the mere suggesting of something could give someone the false impression of having experienced it. So one example is, like, I think they told a student to propose to a vending machine, and then they just told another student to imagine proposing to a vending machine. They did this to many students, and then afterwards they asked them, did you propose to the vending machine? And many of the students who were just supposed to imagine that they had said that, no, I actually proposed to it. They were insistent. Like, I remember getting down on one knee and I proposed to this thing. So even the mere suggestion of some outlandish thing, you would think that how could you forget not doing that? Of course, you would know whether you actually proposed to a vending machine, but in many cases, even something outlandish like that, the suggestion of it could be implanted as a memory that people think they actually remember.
Elizabeth Loftus, I think you referenced her in your book. She's the most famous example was the Lost in a Mall memory that she just asked her subjects about multiple things about their childhood, one of which she just made up. Do you remember when you were lost in a mall? Oh, yeah. And then they go off on all the details about the person that found them. They heard their mother's name through the loudspeaker and so on and so on. And it's like, but that never happened. And so just by asking, or a simpler example was, you show one group of subjects a car crash, and you ask them how fast would you project the cars were traveling when they collided with each other. The other one when they smashed into each other. So the smashed in group gave a higher estimated speed. the lawyers, I think they've known all this for a long time, right? and
Yeah.
the scientists are just now catching up.
My hunch would be, I don't remember the study in particular, Loftus about being lost in the mall. My hunch would be when she reveals to the people that actually I made this one up, that they wouldn't recant. Instead, they would double down.
Yeah.
My hunch would be that, no, this actually happened. Like, I remember I was there and this guy picked me up.
Yeah, that would be curious. I'll have to ask her about that because she did debrief them afterwards because that's required now. Part
because
of the informed consent.
It's somewhat reminiscent of another example I provide in that last chapter of Leon Festinger, when he kind of is embedded in this cult that predicts the end of the world, the apocalypse is coming, God is going to destroy the world in a massive flood, and they predict a specific day on which this is going to happen. So, he wants to observe, what are they going to do when this doesn't happen? Are they going to abandon the cult? Are they going to admit that they were wrong or something else? And it turns out after the predicted flood didn't happen, so there's this disconfirming evidence, some people do leave the cult, but what many of them do is double down and say, no, we were right to believe that the world was going to end, and they find a way to rationalize why they were right. The explanation that ends up winning out is that, well, God was going to destroy the end of the world, but because we believed in its destruction so fervently, he decided to spare it. So really, we spare the world. We caused it to, so this is proof that we were right. So the disconfirming evidence becomes evidence of the thing that was actually disconfirmed.
Yeah. Cognitive dissonance. Yeah. Yeah. Or we miscalculated the date. We forgot to carry the 1. So it's next year.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. There's always ways to get around that. Well, I mean, there's just so much about the human mind that we really still don't understand, and trying to understand why people do this. I think we'll never be able to predict like who the next terrorists are going to be or the next school shooter in a way, because they themselves don't even know their own behavior. They can't predict. A lot of suicides happen quite randomly. People suffering from severe depression and so on. But the day that they actually do it, the people that have tried to do it and survived said, I don't know. I just woke up that morning and went, you know what? That's it. Today's the day. It
at
wasn't
some point
like, you could have predicted it weeks ago or months ago and intervened. It's hard.
At some point, the butterfly effect seems to come into play. So you can predict on average that, when you have a large population, you could predict that how many people are going to forget to put a stamp on their envelope and send it to the post service. Think about all the chance events that have to happen for you to forget to put the stamp on the envelope. For any one particular person, you could never predict what day they're going to do that on. But for a group of people, on average, 2 of them are going to do it this week. So it's the easy thing is knowing if you have a whole population, some people are going to do it. The hard prediction is, and specifically, because at some point, it's like the butterfly effect. You drop a glass on the floor and that causes you to forget to pick up the stamp. But who could have predicted you were going to drop the glass that day? It's just
exactly.
impossible.
Yeah, or like, being raised in an abusive home or impoverished home or crappy schools, bad neighborhoods, and so on. On average, this is not good, so we want to do something about that. But some people, and the biggest, most famous example is LeBron James, he turned that into, a stellar career. This is my motivation. I'm going to crawl out of the gutter here and become a world champion. Why him and not the other guy? Of course, there's natural talents and gifts and things like that, but the motivation differences, who knows? I mean, it's really hard to say.
Yeah, it is.
Oh boy. All right, John, that's a good place to end. I got to go pick up my kid now. Project Mind Control, Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA, and the tragedy of MKUltra. Love that cover, by the way. It's a very kind of 1970s, 60s cover.
I'm so glad you said that, because I thought, man, I think it really gives the vibe of the book. It's almost a little clinical, but kind of playful with the colors too. But a little maybe psychotropic or something. Yeah,
yes,
it's neat.
Yeah, totally. Oh, what was the TV? What was the TV show that used that image? Was it Outer Limits? I think used it, not the other.
I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, I love that. All right. Well, when it's made into a film, we'll have you back on to promote it.
I hope so. We can cross our fingers and hope that happens. Thanks so much for having me on. Big fan of the podcast and your books as well.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. All right.